Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In this video I'm going to continue the series on the Catalan with finally the main move black can play in the Open Catalan, and that's pawn to a6. By far the main line, by far black's best and trickiest option, and white has to work hard to keep an advantage or to prove an advantage against this move. The idea behind a6 is to basically play b5 unhindered and to defend your extra pawn. Therefore, in some lines, black will keep the pawn after white's best play, and what I'm going to recommend, white regains the pawn. But again, it's going to be hard to prove an advantage. This is the 8th video in the series on the Catalan, and in the series on the Open Catalan. We're talking about this position. The only move I haven't talked about so far is the move bishop b4 check, which is going to be covered when we look at bishop b4 before pawn takes pawn. So I just wanted to mention that because I got some questions. So okay, talking about this position, it's sharp. Black took a pawn. In order to keep the pawn, he has to lag in development, and white gets the initiative. So after a6, black wants to defend the c4 pawn with b5, and white's compensation is the center and the lead in development. Of course, white has the option of advancing with e4, and this results in very, very complex games. Now, before we get onto the main line, I just want to give you the sidelines for white, which I don't want to talk about too much because I'm covering the Catalan. For white, I will be giving you all the options for black, so you will be prepared against anything black plays, but I'm going to be recommending variations for white, so I'm not going to be covering everything white can do in detail. I will mention it though. So we are going to be focusing on the move castles on move 6, but this is by far the most popular and best. Let's just have a look at the alternatives to make sure you don't blunder them in a game accidentally. Firstly, a4, preventing b5 by brute force. Spending a tempo on a4 is bad because after knight c6, obviously b3 is weak and b4 is weak, and there is no way to compensate for that. So in this position you simply castle. Black plays the move rook to b8. Now again, b5 is threatened. You have to play a5, which now leaves a ton of holes in your position. Bishop b4. You can play knight a3 targeting the pawn, but simply bishop takes a5, and after knight takes c4, bishop b4, black is better. Black is undoubtedly better here. So a4, not a good move. You cannot fight a6 with a4. Now, a few more bad options, even worse. If you try to play knight c3, then b5, of course, happens. And if you try knight e5 now, trying to use the Catalan diagonal, then simply knight d5, and you have nothing. You have nothing better but to take. So knight d5 and e d5, and after white castles, obviously black has this enormous pawn majority marching towards your king and the queen side and nothing. Okay, so knight c3 is bad. Let's move on. Another bad move is queen to c2, preparing to take on c4 and preparing to expand with e4. Same idea as knight c3, black plays b5. Not good. Okay, another mistake is bishop to g5. This move has been played. The idea is basically to prevent knight d5 and to push e4, but again, after b5 and knight e5, in this position knight d5 is of course not possible, but black can simply play rook a7, and again, he will definitely keep his extra pawn, and he's definitely better. You have absolutely nothing. Now, instead of castles, which is the main move, one move which does deserve some attention is knight e5, which opens up the h1a diagonal immediately, attacks the c4 pawn immediately. If you can take the pawn with the knight, then that's great. And black now has to fight to keep his pawn. That being said, black is equal and has a very nice way to equalize. Let me show you that. Black should play bishop b4 check, and after knight c3 he should play knight d5. And now taking the knight is simply bad because you give up your Catalan bishop. Playing bishop to d2 is fairly tame and passive. Black is going to be keeping the pawn in that line. So after, for example, bishop to d2, black can simply play knight b6, keeping the pawn. You can play e3 and he plays knight to d7. This pawn is secure. no problems in the black position. For example, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and after knight e4, a5 can be played defending the bishop. Both sides castle, queen c2, rook d8, and black is fine. So another option, which is far more interesting, is castles, simply in this position. And of course this gives up a pawn. So knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, attacking the rook, rook to b1. Now of course there is pressure on the b7 pawn. b5 of course is impossible because of rook takes b8. So white, well, is targeting a lot of stuff in the black position. Black has only one option, and that's to give up some material with queen takes d4, and after queen a4 check, black basically has nothing better but to play b5, and at the end of the rainbow there's this rook. So queen a3, stopping black from castling, queen e5, bishop f4, chasing the queen away to f6, bishop takes c7, and after that you will be taking the rook, and after, for example, bishop e5, which is the best move, then you grab the rook. So, but after bishop e5, queen e5, bishop a8, queen c7, bishop g2, f6, rook fd1, I don't have to say that the position is perfectly equal. It's 2 pawns for the exchange, and black has a 3-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side, which is extremely dangerous, and it's equal. So even knight e5 doesn't lead to an advantage for white. In my opinion, the only way to play for an advantage against the main line is to play the move castles, and by far the most popular. White is continuing the development. Now black has two options here. Black can either develop with knight c6, and this is the main move we are going to be focusing on. The idea behind knight c6 is to free up this diagonal and then continue rook b8, b5, bishop d7, defending the knight, moving the rook away and trying to defend his pawn. Alternatively, something that can be played but is definitely not recommended as it's inferior to knight c6 is b5, defending the pawn straight away. And now the line is pretty forced. Knight e5, knight d5, a4, just preparing to take here, and the rook is pinned, so bishop b7 unpinning, and now b3, and you blast open the position. Now c3 and cb3 can be played. c3 is better. C takes b3, a takes b5, a takes b5, rook a8, bishop a8, and queen b3 is definitely more pleasant for white. He's for the moment still a pawn down, but this huge lead in development is almost insurmountable. So for example c6, which is a good move. Now look at these two pieces. e4 chases the knight away, the knight drops back to c7. Look at these three pieces now. You can play queen f3 here, which is very aggressive, and after queen f6 you can play something like bishop f4. And in this position the engine says white is almost winning. It's plus 1.5. So c takes b3 leads to a pleasant position for white. If c3 is played, which is better, then you have, well, a complicated line which you have to know as black and as white, and that starts with e4. And if black moves the knight, then of course knight takes c3 and white should be easily winning. Therefore black complicates matters with the move b4. And here I would like to stop for a moment. This you have to know as white. I'm going to be recommending something against the main lines, but this is basically what you have to know against b5 instead of knight c6. So in this position you take the piece, e d5, bishop d5, and now you have to play aggressively. So black has these two pawns, which are very good. Obviously in some positions it's even going to be possible to give up the bishop and then force through one of the pawns. So you play aggressively, queen h5, and g6 is forced. And now queen to h3. And this is a ton of pressure on black. It's not easy to develop. You can play bishop h6, trading of the bishop, and you're a piece up. But again, the engine says it's equal, but white should be better. It's a piece up. And these two pawns for the moment are not advancing, but they could be. So that's b5. And I don't think you have to be afraid of that. Now, after a6 and castles, knight c6 is something you have to study carefully. Now, I've read 2 books on this position. One of them is by Boris Savruk, and that's probably the best book on the Catalan that I've seen, read, had in my hands. And Boris Savruk recommends something I don't like. I'm still going to mention it for white, but I'm going to be looking at a completely different line. In this position, there are a few options for white. Let's go over the bad options first. One bad option is knight a3. I'm going to tell you why. Knight bd2 also, just dreadful. a4, a dreadful move. Bishop g5, similar to the main line, which I want to show you with e3, but you develop the bishop first, trade it off on f6, and then play e3 without closing in your bishop. So bishop g5 is kind of sensible, but giving up the bishop pair in a position in which you're supposed to attack, I wouldn't recommend. And two main moves are e3 and knight c3. Now, knight c3 you still have to be aware of, because you may want to play an aggressive game. Again, I'm not going to recommend this. Knight c3 is, according to Avruk, the best move. And here's a short quote. Avruk says, recently this move has gained in popularity. Although 7e3 remains white's most popular option, still it's possible that the shift will continue, as nowadays white is failing to prove any advantage after this timid pawn advance. And that's true. e3 is a timid move. Knight c3 is much sharper. But I honestly believe e3 will give you better chances. So if you would like to study knight c3 for white, buy Avruk's book. Great book. Okay, let me show you knight c3 just briefly. The idea behind knight c3 is to force through e4 quickly without, well, paying any attention to what black is doing, basically. So in this position, black simply continues preparing his plan with b5. You play e4, black develops with bishop to e7, and you play queen e2. Now, black's main is to just defend the c4 pawn. He could also grab the pawn. So, for example, knight takes d4 is an option, and after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, white continues rook d1, and white should be better here. After queen c5, you can continue e5, and after knight d7, knight e4. It's not, of course, possible to take the pawn with the knight because white takes the queen. If you take the pawn with the queen, it's of course not knight d6 check, which can be taken with the bishop, and then the bishop defends the queen. But instead, white gets a winning position after bishop f4, and after queen a5, queen takes c4. This is just very hard to play. So against knight e4, black should continue queen b4, and it's a very complicated position. White should be slightly better, but it's so hard to play. And the other option is b5, which I think is better for black, and now rook d1, castles, and d5. And you blast open the center straight away, so you are letting black keep the pawn. This is the part I don't like. So ed5, e5, d4, ef6, bishop f6. This is very sharp. And after, for example, queen e4, attacking the knight, then bishop to b7, and knight d5, and this just gets ridiculous. Obviously, black has given a piece up again, but he has all 8 pawns, and this is 3 pawns for the piece, and these pawns are looking very dangerous. White's pieces are uncoordinated, and I just don't like this position. That being said, if you want to play for a win at all costs, knight c3 is definitely a better move than e3. But if you want to make sure that you don't lose, then e3 is better. Okay, so we are going to be focusing on the move e3. Okay, and after a6 and castles and knight c6, this is just the best move. And still white is preparing e4. It's not that we don't want to play e4, but the idea is to play queen e2, rook fd1, and knight c3, and play e4 slowly. So e3 is definitely a smarter move. Now what can black do? Again, there are a couple of options. If he plays b5, that's a bad move, knight e5, and game over. So b5 straight away is not possible. So he again can either prepare the move b5 with bishop to d7, defending the knight, or with rook to b8. Two options. Bishop d7 is by far the most popular. If rook b8, let me just show you that quickly, there's a really nice move white can play, which doesn't come up often in the Catalan, but it's a pattern you have to know. And I believe after this move, white doesn't really have any issues, and that's knight f to d2. And after knight f to d2, you still have the option to play knight c3 later on, supporting e4 and defending d5. And this obviously prevents b5. If b5, bishop takes. And if nothing is done, then knight takes pawn. So black has to play energetically. If he plays slowly with queen d7, which is possible, then simply knight takes c4 and b5, the knight is now defended, knight c to d2, fine, bishop e7, knight c3, black castles. This is a slow, tame position. White should have an annoying slight edge, and eventually the fact that he has an extra central pawn, the c2 pawn has been traded for the d7 pawn, is going to prove important. However, after knight f to d2, black has a way to play more aggressively, and that's e5, blasting the center open and preparing to develop the bishop along this diagonal. Against this, there's a simple antidote. Bishop takes knight, and after b takes, d takes e5. Knight g4 to try to regain the pawn, knight takes c4, bishop e6 attacks the knight, knight b to d2, and in this position, well, it's 7, well, black actually has 6 pawns for the moment, excuse me. But after bishop to b4, it's going to be hard to keep that pawn. But white should be perfectly fine. I don't see any problems with white's position. So rook b8, I wouldn't recommend that for black. As I said, after this move, knight f to d2, it's very hard to get anything. With black, I believe it's impossible to equalize if white knows the next 5 or 6 moves. So finally, black's best. Bishop to d7. This is the move we are going to be focusing on. Now, this move makes it really hard for white to claim an edge. I'm not going to lie to you. This is the reason why Avruk, who is probably the biggest author on the Catalan for white, doesn't like e3. And here's why. You continue with queen e2. Just black has to play b5, or alternatively he can play bishop d6, which is a sideline I don't think many people would play. It's just sensible to defend the pawn. So now let's just have a brief look at bishop d6. You can then take the pawn, of course. Black can castle, and after rook to d1, black is saying, well, I want to develop instead of losing, so that's smart, but he gave the pawn back. And now after rook b8, knight bd2, queen e7, queen e2 back in anticipation of advances in the center or on the side, e5, d5, knight e5, knight e5, and bishop e5. White can simply play knight c4 and again be slightly better. There are targets on the queen side. It's not easy to push those pawns, and white is slightly better coordinated in my opinion. So for example, bishop a4 is one of the best moves, and rook to d2, rook f to d8. White should have an annoying edge, and that's what you get. But bishop d6 is not the trickiest black can do. This is just if black wants to fight for equality without risking too much. But you can grab the bishop pair. There are a few options here for white. For example, rook b1 is the main move, just preparing to advance this pawn and maybe go for a minority attack. So for example, bishop b5, b3 defending the knight, bishop c4, bc4 or queen c4 are both possible. Queen c4 I think is better. c6 defending along this diagonal. And all games from this position have ended in a draw. That says enough. But again, white shouldn't have absolutely any issues. Black should have slight issues, because even though he has a 3-2, it's hard to push it because of this bishop, and black is not really targeting anything for the moment. White, of course, has the bishop pair, which in itself shouldn't be enough to win, but it's a slight edge. So if you can get a position where you have a target and black doesn't, you have the bishop pair, then why not? So against queen e2, I don't think bishop d6 is the way for black to play. He should keep his pawn. Now, b5, this is basically the starting position. This is the starting position of the mainline Open Catalan, and this is where you have to start learning. Now, alternatives to what I'm going to show you, and now I'm going to show you an aggressive continuation. I'm going to be showing you b3, which is by far the best move and the main theoretical move. You could play slowly with rook d1, you could play slowly with knight c3, you could play too aggressively with e4. You could also play with knight e5. They're all okay. As I said, there are a couple of options for white. I'm going to be focusing on what I think is best. If you'd like to learn the other moves, buy books, and maybe some other people recommend other moves. I'm not aware of that. Okay, so b3. And in this position, black has no other option but to take. If he doesn't take, you're just going to grab the pawn. So after cb3, you have now given black the pawn almost permanently. So after you take ab3, black is a pawn up, and well, you have to do something about that. What you get in compensation is that the a file is open, your bishop is open, your knight can jump into the game, the b5 pawn is weak, this knight can be extremely tricky, this bishop could come to a3 in some positions. It's a very sharp position and hard for black to play. Obviously these pieces don't really have a bright future, and this king is still on e8. So black has two options here, both involve castling in the next two moves. So he can either play bishop e7 or bishop d6. Bishop e7 is the best move. Bishop d6 is nothing to be worried about though. This bishop aims at nothing. So you can just continue bishop b2. Black castles. So now simply rook c1. You don't do anything abnormal, or well, you don't do anything fancy. You just get all of your pieces to the best possible squares. Black now has to start thinking about the defense. So knight d5, you don't really want stuff advancing. So knight c3, challenging that knight. Knight c to b4. Black tries to be tricky, but not knight e4. And here, in fact, black's best is to play a5 and to try and continue the position like that. After a5, whoa, sorry. For some reason the engine turned on. After a5 and knight c5, white is +1 according to the engines. I think the pieces are just too well coordinated, and you continue with e4, and after the knight retreats to b6, you continue with d5, and you just blast open the position. And obviously these two bishops compensate for a pawn. More importantly, this pawn could drop, this pawn could drop. It's just very hard for black to play. And this bishop being on e7, as we're going to see in the main line, is going to keep this queen alive and better coordinated with the other pieces. So bishop d6 I don't think is the optimal move, although it has been played by some of the best players, so it's not bad. I just think bishop e7 is best. Now we continue in the same fashion. Here's what we do. We do bishop b2, castles, and rook c1. Same moves. And now again, knight to b4 can be played, or knight to d5 first. We play knight e5, attacking the rook. If the rook moves, the pawn could be in trouble. So knight f to d5. And here's a nice move. In this position, we don't play knight c3. Here's where we have to... Well, this is still a very forced line. About 60 games from this position. Most of them have ended in a draw, but that's because people know everything in this position. It's been very heavily analyzed. But if white knows everything same as black, he should be slightly better. So the key move, and the only move in this position, is knight to a3. Okay, after knight to a3, you're preparing knight c2, challenging this annoying piece. That's the whole point. Okay, bishop to e8, saving the bishop pair. And now finally, we are ready for what we've been preparing for the last 5 or 6 moves. We play e4, and all the pieces are now optimal. After e4, the knight has to retreat to b6. It's a very passive square. And now knight to c2, challenging black's best piece. Now, if black moves the knight away, then he will definitely be worse. The best move is simply to play a5, and this is a forced line, a5 defending the knight. We take the knight, bishop takes knight, and now we jump in with knight c6. And here, black is still a pawn ahead, but that's going to change quickly. If this knight is taken, which is the main line, we have very aggressive rooks along the c-file. If this knight is not taken, then I just take your bishop and take your pawn, or take your pawn and then threaten to take the bishop. If you move the queen, I have too many options. So bishop takes c6. And after rook takes c6, this is the key position. What do we have? Okay, so white has the bishop pair. Black has a regate pawn majority on the queen side, has a weird knight on b6 with no squares to go to, sort of semi-loose bishop on b4, which if bishop a3 or bishop c3 could be driven away or exchanged, a hanging pawn on b5, and obviously a weak c7 pawn. Also the f8 rook is not in play yet. On the other hand, white's pieces I don't think could be any better. I don't think there are better squares for any of white's pieces. So if I turn on the engine, it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. But who would want to play black here? I think it's just much easier to play for white. So as you saw, black has to continue a4 to complicate matters. And now, if you don't know this, then you could mess up. But the move is rook to c1. You just have to keep playing actively. You have to keep playing actively. Taking the pawn leads nowhere. You can just take on b5 with the queen or take on c7 first, so a3. And now you want to keep these pawns locked, so bishop a1. This doesn't make your bishop any worse. The bishop is still a monster, defending the center and looking through to g7, also preventing this pawn from queening. So now black is forced to defend, rook a7, and now you simply get your pawn back. Now the material is even. White still has the bishop pair. Black still has to coordinate his pieces. Firstly, has to defend the bishop, so queen e7, for example. And now there are a ton of different approaches. This position has been reached 15, 16, 17 times. Most people play queen h5. You can play queen e2. You can play h4, h5, h6. You can play bishop h3. There are a couple of ways to play, but basically this is the position in which, if you're a serious tournament player, you have to start learning. If you face somebody 21, 22, 2300 who plays a6 in the Open Catalan, this is the position you are going to reach. It's inevitable. So I'm sorry, but you have to know 25 moves of theory. That's just what it's like when you play an opening such as the Catalan. I've been preparing this a lot, and I honestly believe that what I've recommended gives white great options. As we saw in all lines, white ends up with the bishop pair with a very active center, and black ends up with really awkward pieces. On the other hand, the a3 pawn, so maybe black wins because of that. But on the other hand, after something like queen h5, I don't want to be black here. This seems really hard to play. I mean, everything is going to join together around this poor king, which lacks defense. This knight, if this knight was on f6, then completely different story. So let's just go through all of that again. So we have the Open Catalan, and black plays a6, we castle. Okay, that's the best move. Black plays knight c6, he could also play b5. We play e3. Again, if you want to play something sharper, play knight c3, preparing an immediate e4, but e3 is better. Now, rook b8 is possible, but bishop d7 is the best move. We play queen e2. b5 has to be played, otherwise bishop d6 leads to an annoyingly better position for white, slightly better, but annoying, because white gets the pawn straight away, so b5. And now the key move, b3, blasting open the position. Black has nothing better but to accept the pawn. A takes b3, bishop e7 or bishop d6, bishop e7 is better, and we continue. Bishop b2, rook c1, knight e5, knight a3, knight c2, e4, and blast open the position and play with our two wonderful bishops. Okay, I think I've given you a good weapon against the mainline Open Catalan. Again, other approaches are possible. It would mean that I would have to record a 10-hour long video to go through all the options for white. I think this one is enough, and I hope it helps. Let me know what you think. Please, any feedback is really appreciated, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.